Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to American History Class, live from the woods behind my house. Today we are diving into the heart of the 1960s, so I thought I would wear very 60s appropriate clothing here, so Carlos Santana greets you. So anyway, today, we've mentioned in the last couple videos, some of the things that started in the 1960s. And the early 60s are largely a continuation of the 50s as far as cultural things are concerned. But the 60s, as we think of them, when you say the 60s, the images that are immediately conjured in your minds tend to have to do with the last two-thirds of the 1960s, with the domestic unrest, the rise of the counterculture and hippie movements, the transition from the civil rights movement starting to be accompanied by an active Black Power movement like the Black Panthers. You're starting to have the Vietnam War ramps up and becomes closer to a more full-scale conflict that involved many Americans being drafted, which spawned the most significant anti-war movement in American history. There had been some protesters of the Spanish-American War or the Mexican War beforehand, but normally rallied around the flag once the war started. Vietnam's the first war where people not only criticized the war at the jump, but continue to protest it as it goes on. You've got a whole bunch of things happening that are changing American culture in a very rapid way throughout the 1960s and 1970s. It's considered to be pretty turbulent times. I'm sure people always think that the era they're living in is the most turbulent era that's ever lived, but I'm pretty sure that the people in the 1960s would have thought the same thing. And of course, the thing about the 60s is it's a mixed bag, because it brings us some great things like integration, the music was fantastic. The 60s and 70s will never be top for music ever. If society goes on another 10,000 years, it'll never get better than 1967 to 1972. It just won't happen. You had some positive movements, but you also had some negative things as well. Obviously, the Cold War is raging. And there's fears of communist activities in different parts of the world. You see there's a massive rise in like drug abuse and stuff like that. And you have really the beginnings of the decline of the American family unit. So we'll all talk about all that stuff for the next 3 videos or so. But today we want to start with where the 60s, as the era of turbulence that we think of, really gets started, and that is the huge psychological shock that is the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. Kennedy is assassinated in the fall of 63. He's about a year out from running for re-election, where he probably would have been the favorite in a re-election campaign. He was going to Texas. He had there were some intelligence warning of people saying, maybe the president going to the city of Dallas right now might not be a great thing, because there was some unrest there. But he goes to Dallas, Texas to do, ultimately he was going to do a fundraising event for the forthcoming campaign. He is riding in a motorcade, which was like a parade led by the presidential vehicle. I'm sure you've seen the visual at some point by this point in your life. But again, something that we've never done since, and we'll probably never do again, was the president, going by, in a vehicle, open air, exposed to the outside. And, there was a period of time we talked about where, being the president was kind of a dangerous job, because we lost Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley within a period of about 50 years. But it had been a little while since we'd had an assassination, and Kennedy does prove to be the last one. Reagan actually was shot, but he survived. So, Kennedy is, driving past, he's riding through Dallas. In the car with him was the First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, as well as the Governor of Texas, John Connally. and in a book observatory, an observatory in a library along the route, sat a sniper by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he fired several shots into the motorcade and killed President Kennedy, and I want to say one other person may have been killed as well. I can't remember for sure, but then I know that the governor of Texas, John Connally, was also injured in the shooting as well, and he, barely survived. He wound up pulling through, but Kennedy was caught pretty much right in the head and had no real chance of survival. And Oswald was the official ruling of the Warren Commission, which was the committee that was in charge of investigating the crime. Described Oswald as Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin, as a quote unquote lone nut gunman, and that does seem to be the most probable explanation. Obviously, the Kennedy assassination is great fodder for conspiracy theory. I am generally very anti-conspiracy theory, and there's a few reasons for that. One, most of the time, in my opinion, conspiracy theory is about trying to paint a bad guy so that you feel better about the seeming randomness, right? So, a lot of all these people that want to be like. A lot of these conspiracy theorists want to believe that nothing bad can just happen by chance. And in a sense, it's a little more comforting, because if the coronavirus came through because of the Illuminati, then that's a lot more comforting than, oh dear Lord, a virus just came through and wiped out a decade of economic progress like that, and there's nobody to blame for it. People get frustrated with that reality sometimes, and so you certainly can blame the Chinese for not doing more about warning the world about everything, or for not having better security standards at their research facilities. But but the idea that everything has to be some conspiracy ignores the fact that a lot of really major historical events have just kind of happened by random chance on paper. Of course, we believe, obviously, God's providential, and all that. But from an earthly perspective, there's not always some that you can blame. And conspiracy theorists always want to have some shady bad guy that, if they ever were taken down, could explain everything that happened. But normally, it's just not true. The Kennedy thing, I'm sympathetic, though. There are a few things about the Kennedy thing that are a little shady. And part of the reason why people are suspicious about Kennedy was we were never able to have a trial for Oswald where we could have found out more about where he would have had the chance to testify. Because as Oswald is being taken to court to go to the beginning of his trial, a man by the name of Jack Ruby, who was the owner of a nightclub in the Dallas area with ties to the mafia, walks up to Lee Harvey Oswald as he's being taken in handcuffs to the courthouse, steps right up to him with a gun, shoots him point blank on the chest on national television. People watched live on national TV as Lee Harvey Oswald is gunned down right before he can testify. Well, needless to say, that's a little shady. And that was really the birth of, along with some seeming odd things about the path that the bullet took and so forth, that's kind of the birth of the whole Kennedy conspiracy theory genre. Some people say, maybe did the mafia have a thing to do with it? And that's a reasonable theory, because Kennedy's family riches actually came from bootlegging. That's how Joe Kennedy, his father, had made the family fortune. And so they had kind of ties to organized crime. And then in 1960, when Kennedy ran against Vice President Nixon for the presidency for the first time, it was one of the closest elections in American history. I didn't talk about this as much as I ought to have in the other video. And it really came down to the state of Illinois. And really, the state of Illinois, it's been pretty much proven, very few people dispute this anymore, it's been pretty much proven that Kennedy won Illinois based on the Chicago mob doing an awful lot of ballot stuffing in his favor. So Kennedy arguably, really maybe shouldn't have even been the president. And the mob was behind a lot of that. And then Kennedy turns around and he names his brother Robert Kennedy to be the Attorney General. And Robert Kennedy was really John Kennedy's right hand, and almost equal in influence with the president in some ways. Certainly the most powerful man in the administration. He turns around as the Attorney General and launches the largest anti-mafia campaign in American history. Becomes the first president to really dedicate the Department of Justice to bringing down the power of the mob. So there's a major theory that the mob felt betrayed because Kennedy owed them, and then turned around and went the other way on them. So that's one theory. Obviously, there's various any number of reasons why the Cubans or the Soviet the Cubans in particular, with all the times that Kennedy has tried to kill Castro, would have had some motivation. But if everything is as it is on the record, then Oswald's motivation was probably revenge for the attempted assassinations of Castro. Oswald was a communist. He had developed communist sympathies. He had actually spent some time in the Soviet Union. He had actually spent some time in Cuba. He was known as he was in particular an admirer of Fidel Castro. And John F. Kennedy was a very committed Cold Warrior. As much as, he may have been moderate to liberal on domestic policy, but although in some ways he's pretty conservative by today's standards, but on Cold War policy, he was as diehard a Cold Warrior and ready to fight the Soviets as anybody. And so it seems like in the midst of that Cold War context, the communist Oswald is motivated to take Kennedy out of the game. So, and I'll try to remember tomorrow when I send this out to send out the link if you just want to watch it for fun. I would have shown it in class if we'd have been in class. There's a video that you can see on YouTube of what it was like as the original newscast of Kennedy's being announced. It actually happened. The video that I often show, it starts in the middle of a soap opera on CBS. They interrupt the soap opera with a news bulletin that Kennedy had been shot. They actually try to go back to the soap opera for just a few minutes. By the time they come back, they're doing a voiceover because they haven't been able to get a camera rolling yet, because it took time to get the old TV cameras warmed up to run. And so you're just seeing like a screen like you'd see like the introduction of a cartoon, and them talking over it saying, President Kennedy's in critical condition. We don't know if he's alive or dead, and then over time, over the course of, I think there's a couple hours of footage on there. I don't show the whole thing. I should, flip around on it. But after a little while, you can see where they finally come back, and famously Walter Cronkite, who was the most famous news anchor of his generation, takes his glasses off and announces in a very somber tone that they had confirmation that President Kennedy had passed away, was declared dead on arrival at the hospital there in Dallas. They also showed the event he was going to, the campaign fundraiser he was going to, kind of was turned into a prayer vigil when people found out what was happening, and so you actually could see some of the ministers who were going to be there for the thing, instead of just being another face in the crowd, wound up being taken to the front and issuing prayers for the president and so forth. So Kennedy. So Kennedy dies, and the presidency is assumed by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson actually had probably one of the best resumes of any president we ever had going into the presidency. He had at one point in time been the Senate Majority Leader. He was a surly son of a gun. He liked to cuss a lot. He was, despite the fact we'll talk in a minute about some great things he did on the civil rights front in his personal life, he was violently racist. But he wound up, doing the right thing on some legislation for political reasons. Johnson has a little bit of a. He was a little bit more hands-on than a lot of presidents were, a little less comfortable with delegation, which is going to be a major issue when we get to the Vietnam War, as we'll talk about, whereas most presidents tend to, start the war and then kind of let generals lead it. He was often, literally sitting in the room in the White House, okaying and turning down bombing targets in North Vietnam. It's kind of a surprising tack to take. And the Kennedy assassination is one of a number of high-profile assassinations that happened, in a 10-year period. Very soon, not long thereafter, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be assassinated by a man named James Earl Ray while in Memphis, Tennessee. There's going to be an assassination of JFK's brother Robert, who's going to run for president in '68 and get shot by the Palestinian nationalist Sirhan. So there's an awful lot of political violence that takes place within the 1960s. So Johnson comes in and becomes a very consequential president. And Johnson, it's definitely a major pro and con situation. Pro, he passes some of the strongest civil rights legislation we ever had. Con, he creates the Great Society, which is the real expansion of the welfare system from the New Deal era to the modern behemoth that it became. And in many ways, we've found to have been actually counterproductive towards achieving some of its aims. And then also he stepped up our involvement in the Vietnam War, which is probably a con. Although I was sympathetic to what we're trying to do in Vietnam. Obviously, it seemed like it was maybe a little bit beyond our ability to do certain things. We'll talk about that in the next video. So probably Johnson's signature political victory was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There had been some Civil Rights Act that had been passed before in '57, I believe, when Eisenhower was president, and there had been a couple beforehand. But the '64 Act was by far the strongest. It had been shepherded a little bit by Kennedy at one point. Kennedy was in favor of working towards this bill. He died before he could sign it. So Johnson becomes the man who's able to put his signature on it. The '64 Civil Rights Bill basically ends segregation in public facilities, and actually overrode, because one thing about segregation is that a lot of it was actually the consequence of government overreach originally. Like, a lot of the segregation was mandated by state law. It wasn't really it wasn't just that restaurant owners chose to, exclude certain clientele from coming in. It's that they weren't allowed to not at times in some of these states. So they not only undid all of those state laws with this federal law, but also, didn't just make it mandatory, but also made it illegal to discriminate on account of race. And so it kind of, and the way they did that, they kind of had to create a federal civil rights apparatus where, in the event of alleged, racial discrimination, you could, take your court case through, kind of through a federal system instead of a state one, because good luck getting an Alabama state legislature to, in the 1960s to find that you had been discriminated against. So that was a major deal. It basically is the end of the Jim Crow era, and you start moving into formal integration of pretty much every aspect of American life. Now, of course, there's still going to be discrimination that's going to continue for years, and there's a number of loopholes and things and ways that people found to discriminate. But it was no longer going to be done with the backing of the government. So from now on, any discrimination that happened was not governmentally created.